All right. We have not covered this subject in a while, but you do have some interesting news on the transgender medicine front. Now, a lot of people, when you bring up that this is going to go down in history like lobotomy as one of those great crimes of the medical industry and one of those terrible mistakes, what about all of these medical associations? Now, if you've read, for example, Deborah So's book, The End of Gender, you know that a lot of what is passing itself off as science is actually activism, where people who are willing to toe the line with gender ideology get the grants and get to do the studies. You get the money and you get the tenure if you're willing to cherry pick data to produce the results that you want. And if you're not willing to go along, you get tremendous pressure from outside activist organizations that should have no say in the production of scientific findings. But as anybody who's really paid attention to this knows, that's not how it goes. I've been saying for a long time this is all going to end in lawsuits, and that's exactly what's happening because now they're having the lawsuits, and what happens in lawsuits? This is why Boeing pled guilty this week. In the discovery process, you have to release emails, you have to release internal documents. As these things are coming out in the lawsuits, people are finding out behind the scenes what's really happening. In April, Hilary Cass, a British pediatrician, published her review of gender identity services for children and young people, commissioned by NHS England. It cast doubt on the evidence base for youth gender medicine. This prompted the World Professional Organization for Transgender Health, WPATH, the leading professional organization for the doctors and practitioners who provide services to trans people, to release a blistering rejoinder. WPATH said that its own guidelines were sturdier, in part because they were based on far more systematic reviews. Court documents recently released as part of the discovery process in a case involving youth gender medicine in Alabama reveal the WPATH's claim was built on shaky foundations. The documents show that the organization's leaders interfered with the production of systematic reviews that it had commissioned from the Johns Hopkins University Evidence-Based Practice Center in 2018. From early on in the contract negotiations, WPATH expressed a desire to control the results of the Hopkins team's work. In December 2017, for example, Donna Kelly, an executive director at WPATH, told Karen Robinson, the EPC's director, that the WPATH board felt the EPC researchers cannot publish their findings independently. A couple of weeks later, Ms. Kelly emphasized that, quote, the WPATH board wants it to be clear that the data cannot be used without WPATH approval, unquote. Hang on, I thought this was all science-based. I thought it's all science-based. Why wouldn't you want the science out there if it's all science-based? Ms. Robinson saw this as an attempt to exert undue influence over what was supposed to be an independent process. Joan Ioannidis of Stanford University, who co-authored guidelines for systematic reviews, says that if sponsors interfere or are allowed to veto results, this can lead to either biased summaries or suppression of unfavorable evidence. Ms. Robinson sought to avoid such an outcome. Quote, in general, my understanding is that the university will not sign off on a contract that allows a sponsor to stop an academic publication, she wrote to Ms. Kelly. Eventually, WPATH relented, and in May 2018, Ms. Robinson signed a contract granting WPATH power to review and offer feedback on her team's work, but not to meddle in any substantive way. After WPATH leaders saw two manuscripts submitted for review in July 2020, however, the parties' disagreements flared up again. In August, the WPATH Executive Committee wrote to Ms. Robinson that WPATH had, quote, many concerns about these papers and that it was implementing a new policy in which WPATH would have authority to influence the EPC team's output, including the power to nip papers in the bud on the basis of their conclusions. Ms. Robinson protested that the new policy did not reflect the contract she had signed and violated basic principles of unfettered scientific inquiry she had emphasized repeatedly in her dealings with WPATH. The Hopkins team published only one paper after WPATH implemented its new policy, a 2021 meta-analysis on the effects of hormone therapy on transgender people. Among the recently released court documents is a WPATH checklist confirming that an individual from WPATH was involved, quote, in the design, drafting of the article, and final approval of that article. The article itself explicitly claims the opposite. Now, more than 6 years after signing the agreement, the EPC team does not appear to have published anything else, despite having provided WPATH with the material for 6 systematic reviews, according to the documents. No one at WPATH or Johns Hopkins has responded to multiple inquiries, so there are still gaps in this timeline. But an email in October 2020 from WPATH figures, including its incoming president at the time, Walter Bowman, to the Working Group on Guidelines, made clear what sort of science WPATH did and did not want published. Research must be, quote, thoroughly scrutinized and reviewed to ensure that publication does not negatively affect the provision of transgender health in the broadest sense, unquote. Mr. Bowman and one other co-author of that email have been named to a World Health Organization advisory board tasked with developing best practices for transgender medicine. Another document recently unsealed shows that Rachel Levine, a trans woman who is Assistant Secretary for Health, succeeded in pressing WPATH to remove minimum ages for the treatment of children from its 2022 standards of care. Dr. Levine's office has not commented. Questions remain unanswered, but none of this helps WPATH's claims to be an organization that bases its recommendations on science. All right, so there you go. This is defining for the entire field of gender medicine. You have activists through, and this is kind of giving you an inside view of the inner workings of how this happens, but they are putting enormous pressure on organizations that do studies not to release studies whose findings they do not like. And when you get a study like that, as Hillary Cass did for the NHS, they try to brand it as right wing. They try to personally attack the authors. They attack the methodology of the study. But when they tell you, look, all of these organizations agree, well, this is why. This is why. This is what's happening behind the scenes. Wherever, in every country where their health systems have not been completely overrun by activists, and they've done a meta-analysis, they have concluded that the evidence base for transgender medicine is extremely weak, particularly in children. And they have universally concluded, as they did in England, that the risks are not justified by the very weak evidence base. And now we can see why. Why do you have this push to medicalize what in many cases is unrelated mental illness that is not even gender dysphoria, which is a genuine condition, but autism? Many of the people diagnosed with gender dysphoria today are actually autistic. Why there is this push is the subject of much speculation. But is it that progressives or liberals need to have a battle to justify their own existence, and once gay marriage and such got passed, well, they had to push into an area that would get pushback? A lot of not-for-profits make their money off ginning up outrage around resistance. Is that it? Is it something more nefarious? Is it part of a Davos objective to at population control? I can't answer that, even based on all the research I've done. But what I can tell you is this is one of the most insane abuses of the health systems that I've ever seen. And as I've mentioned, it most evokes the satanic panic of the 80s. And it's going to end the same way with lawsuits like this. There's actually a case now going to the Supreme Court.
Well, lawsuits that are not settled, evidence becomes public, right? And so I guess I guess if there are enough of them and not all of them get settled, that's where these sort of evidence leaks come from. But I guess if there are enough of them, excuse me, if there are enough of them, then, you know, certain ones that are not settled will have the evidence out there that you can actually look
They
into
can't afford to settle.
what is being litigated. Well, that's the thing. Well, not only can they not afford to settle, but there are certain people who you know, want the evidence out, so they won't accept it. Like, there are certain people who probably don't need the money. There are certain people who are probably pursuing these lawsuits to make the point, right?
Yes,
who are not going to settle because the point of pursuing the lawsuit is to get the information out. And so yeah, I mean, this is something that you said was going to be happening a couple years ago. You know, and I'm sure long prior to that, but for as long as we've had the show here, that's what you've been saying. Now, in terms of like you know, causes to champion, I think times are getting so severe. I think that's part of why you're not seeing as much of this anymore, because times are getting so severe that there are plenty of there is a lot to raise hell about now. That's not this.
There is, and that's honestly, we haven't been covering it as much because there's a genocide going on, like post October 7th. It is also because I feel more that the tide is turning. So the urgency is not as great as I felt it was when these people were winning the argument, or at least they were the most prominent voices in the argument. It's turning back in the other direction because of things like this, because it was never based in evidence. And that was inevitably going to come out. You were going to get all these people whose fucking lives, these poor people whose lives have been destroyed, their bodies have been destroyed, who are going to grow up and sue. Now, what I mean, they can't afford to settle. If they settle, they're giving up the game. They cannot admit wrongdoing. Once they start admitting wrongdoing, the whole edifice of gender ideology falls apart. The whole premise falls apart, and they open themselves up to tremendous backlash, professional, social, and possibly legal. That's why they would not do what Boeing did and just take the plea to avoid discovery. They're between a rock and a hard place. As soon as they admit that there's a basis for these suits, the jig is up.
Please clap.